Stop scrolling, because what you're about to hear is not being explained clearly anywhere. Right now, in one of the most strategically sensitive regions on Earth, the waters around the Strait of Hormuz, something unusual is happening. Not explosions, not headlines, but decisions. Decisions that could quietly reshape global power. For decades, this narrow strip of water has been one of the most important arteries of the global economy, a place where influence matters more than force. And today, that influence is being tested, not just between rivals, but between allies. Why this location matters to understand what's happening, you need to focus on one critical detail. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. It is leverage in its purest form. At its narrowest point, this passage is only about 21 miles wide. Yet despite its limited size, it carries an outsized role in the global economy. Roughly one-fifth of the world's oil supply passes through this corridor every single day. That includes crude oil from major producers like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and United Arab Emirates. But the importance of this route goes far beyond raw numbers. Every tanker that moves through this strait carries more than just fuel. It carries economic stability. It carries political pressure. It carries strategic influence. Because when so much of the world depends on a single route, control over that route becomes power. Not necessarily through ownership, but through influence, proximity, and the ability to disrupt. Now imagine what happens when uncertainty enters this space. Not a full blockade. Not even an official conflict. Just tension. Just signals. Just the possibility that something might go wrong. In global markets, perception often matters more than reality. Even a hint of instability in the Strait of Hormuz can trigger immediate reactions. Oil prices begin to fluctuate. Insurance costs for shipping rise. Companies start rerouting or delaying shipments. Governments begin reviewing emergency reserves. All of this can happen without a single shot being fired, because uncertainty creates hesitation. And hesitation slows everything down. This is what makes choke points like this so powerful. They don't need to be fully closed to have an impact. The mere risk of disruption is enough to ripple across the entire global system. Energy importing countries in Europe and Asia watch these developments closely because their economies are directly tied to stable energy flows. Even a small delay or price spike can affect industries, transportation, and household costs. At the same time, major powers like United States and China understand that influence in this region is not just about military presence. It's about predictability. It's about ensuring that trade continues without disruption. And most importantly, it's about being the actor that others rely on when uncertainty rises. Because in geopolitics, control is not always about dominance. Sometimes it's about being indispensable. And that is why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. Not just because of what moves through it, but because of what happens to the world when that movement is no longer guaranteed. Because in the end, uncertainty in a place like this doesn't stay local. It spreads, quietly, quickly, and often more powerfully than any direct action ever could. The Allies' decision. Here's where the situation begins to shift from predictable to complex. In moments of rising geopolitical tension, history gives us a clear expectation. Western allies tend to move together. Coordination becomes the default response. Statements are aligned, strategies are shared, and decisions are often made within the framework of collective security, especially under the umbrella of NATO. But this time, something felt different. Instead of immediate unity, there was a noticeable pause, not silence, but hesitation. And in geopolitics, hesitation is never random. It signals calculation. Key European powers like Germany, France, and Italy began to communicate a more cautious stance. Their messaging wasn't confrontational, it wasn't openly critical, but it was careful, deliberately measured in tone and intent. They were creating distance, not breaking away. And that distinction matters more than it might seem, because this wasn't about abandoning alliances or weakening long-standing partnerships. These countries remain deeply integrated within shared defense structures. Their militaries train together, plan together, and rely on each other for collective security. But alignment does not mean automatic agreement. And that's the nuance often missed. From the European perspective, the situation presented a difficult balance. On one hand, there is a long-standing commitment to transatlantic cooperation. On the other, there is a growing awareness of the risks associated with rapid escalation in already volatile regions. Stepping in too quickly, especially in a high-tension environment, can have unintended consequences. A limited crisis can expand, a contained situation can spill over, and a regional issue can evolve into something far more difficult to control. This is the core of their hesitation. It wasn't indecision. It was risk management. Because once military assets are deployed, the room for de-escalation narrows. Every move becomes more visible. Every incident carries higher stakes. And every miscalculation becomes harder to reverse. European leaders are acutely aware of this dynamic. They have seen how quickly situations can escalate beyond their original scope. And in a world where economic stability, energy security, and political cohesion are already under pressure, adding another layer of uncertainty is not a decision taken lightly. There is also a domestic dimension to consider. Public sentiment across much of Europe has grown increasingly cautious about external military involvement. Governments are not only managing international relationships, they are also accountable to voters who expect stability, not sudden escalation. So instead of rushing into alignment, these countries chose a more deliberate path. They observed, they assessed, they waited. And in doing so, they signaled something important. That alliance does not eliminate national interest. It coexists with it. This moment, therefore, is not about fracture. It is about recalibration. A recognition that even within strong alliances like NATO, decisions are shaped not just by shared history, but by present realities. And in this case, the reality was clear. The risks of immediate involvement outweighed the benefits. So they stepped back, not to disengage, but to avoid turning a tense situation into an uncontrollable one. Why they held back. This decision wasn't emotional. It was calculated, carefully, deliberately, and with a clear understanding of the risks involved. Because alliances don't function on loyalty alone. They operate on a fundamental principle. Shared risk must come with shared decision-making. When that balance is disrupted, when a situation develops without full consultation, then the expectation of automatic support becomes far more complicated. From the perspective of several European capitals, this was exactly that kind of moment. They were being asked, implicitly or explicitly, to step into a situation they did not fully shape. And that changes the equation. Because collective responsibility is easier to justify when collective input exists from the beginning. Without that, every decision carries more uncertainty, more scrutiny, and more potential consequences. So leaders began weighing their options through a much colder lens, not of ideology, but of risk. And three major concerns stood out. The first was military risk. Any deployment of naval forces into a high-tension environment, especially near a critical choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, comes with inherent danger, not necessarily because conflict is guaranteed, but because miscalculation is always possible. A radar misread, a warning misinterpreted, a vessel moving too close, too fast. These are the kinds of moments that can escalate quickly, often without intention. And once escalation begins, controlling it becomes significantly harder. European military planners understand this well. They know that even limited engagement carries the risk of triggering a chain reaction, one that could expand far beyond the original scope. The second concern was economic. Global energy markets are extremely sensitive to instability, especially in regions tied to major supply routes. Even a small disruption, or the perception of one, can send shockwaves through pricing systems. Oil futures react in real time. Insurance premiums for shipping rise. Supply chains begin to adjust, often at a cost. For economies already dealing with inflationary pressure or slow growth, these fluctuations are not abstract. They are immediate and tangible. Countries across Europe are particularly exposed to energy volatility. Any prolonged disruption in supply routes could translate into higher energy costs, industrial slowdowns, and increased pressure on governments to intervene domestically. So the economic risk was not just a side factor, it was central to the decision-making process. The third concern was political. Public opinion matters, especially in democratic systems. And across much of Europe, there is a growing reluctance toward entering new military entanglements, particularly in situations that appear complex, distant, or unclear in purpose. War fatigue is real. It builds over time, and it influences how governments act. Leaders must consider not only strategic outcomes, but also how their decisions will be perceived at home. Entering a high-risk situation without a clear mandate or broad support could carry serious political consequences. So when all three factors were placed on the table, military uncertainty, economic exposure, and domestic pressure, the conclusion became clearer. This was not a moment for rapid escalation. It was a moment for restraint. So instead of rushing in, they paused. They assessed the situation from multiple angles. They allowed time for signals to become clearer. And in doing so, they created something that often goes unnoticed, but is critically important in global politics: space. Because in geopolitics, a pause is never empty. It opens the door for other actors, other strategies, other outcomes, and sometimes that space becomes the most decisive factor of all: China's approach. And when space appears in global politics, someone eventually fills it. Not always with force, not always with visibility, but with timing, structure, and long-term positioning. In this case, that actor is China. But what makes China's approach fundamentally different from traditional great power behavior is not aggression, it is patience. China does not typically rush into crisis zones with military signaling or direct confrontation. Instead, it builds layers of influence long before any crisis begins. Influence that is economic, logistical, and deeply embedded in trade relationships. It moves through positioning, not projection. Over the past decade, China has steadily expanded its economic footprint across energy-rich regions, including countries like Iran. This relationship has not been built overnight, nor has it been defined by sudden political alignment. Instead, it has developed through consistent trade flows, infrastructure cooperation, and long-term strategic agreements. One of the most important elements of this relationship is energy. China is one of the largest importers of oil in the world. Its industrial system, manufacturing base, and domestic consumption all depend heavily on stable energy supply lines. That dependence naturally pushes China to prioritize predictable access to oil-producing regions. As a result, China has maintained steady oil purchases, often under long-term arrangements that provide both supply security and economic continuity for its partners. These agreements are not just transactional, they create structural dependency on both sides. Alongside energy trade, infrastructure investment has played a key role. Through initiatives such as ports, logistics networks, and industrial zones connected to broader frameworks like the Belt and Road Initiative, China has gradually embedded itself into the physical and economic architecture of multiple regions. These investments rarely attract immediate global attention. They are not dramatic. They do not dominate headlines, but they accumulate value over time. And in geopolitics, accumulation is often more powerful than action. Because when uncertainty arrives, as it always eventually does, the actors with existing networks, established trust, and operational presence are the ones best positioned to respond. This is where China's strategy becomes visible. Not because it suddenly appears during a crisis, but because it was already there before the crisis began. The relationship between China and Iran illustrates this dynamic clearly. Trade flows, energy exports, and long-standing economic coordination have created a level of interdependence that cannot be easily replicated or replaced in the short term. So when instability rises in critical regions like the Strait of Hormuz, China is not starting from zero. It is operating from a position that has been carefully constructed over years. And that changes everything, because influence is not only about presence during moments of tension, it is about who remains essential when others hesitate. And in that sense, China's approach is not defined by dramatic intervention. It is defined by continuity. While others respond to events as they unfold, China often operates within systems it has already helped shape. That is why its role becomes more visible during periods of uncertainty, not because it suddenly increases its power, but because the environment finally reveals the power it has already built. Economic power versus military power. This moment highlights a deeper shift. For decades, global dominance was defined largely by military strength: aircraft carriers, naval fleets, forward bases. But now, Another form of power is becoming just as important: economic interdependence. China doesn't need to control the Strait of Hormuz militarily. It just needs to remain essential to the countries that do. That's a very different kind of leverage, less visible, but often more effective, because it doesn't provoke resistance in the same way. The fragility of alliances. This situation also reveals something deeper about alliances. They are strong, but not automatic. Even within NATO, every member state makes decisions based on its own national interest. Coordination happens when interests align. But when risks feel uneven, unity becomes more complicated. And that's what we're seeing now. Not collapse, not betrayal, but recalibration, a shift in global strategy. So what does all of this mean? It means the global system is evolving, not through dramatic announcements, but through subtle shifts, moments where allies hesitate, rivals adapt, and influence changes hands quietly. China's strategy is not about replacing the United States overnight. It's about becoming unavoidable in trade, in energy, in diplomacy, and moments like this accelerate that process. The bigger picture. What you're witnessing is not a single event. It's part of a pattern, a world moving from clear leadership to shared influence, where power is distributed across multiple centers, and where decisions are less predictable. That doesn't mean one side is winning and the other is losing. It means the game itself is changing. Outro. So the real question isn't, did allies step back or did China step forward? The real question is, what kind of world are we entering when both of those things can happen at the same time? Because that's where the story is heading, not toward a single dominant power, but toward a more complex, more competitive, and far less predictable global order. And this moment, quiet, technical, easy to overlook, might be one of the clearest signals yet.